Hello everyone and welcome back to a short reviews video for September 2022. This is a monthly segment where I basically talk about those albums and EPs where I didn't really feel that I had that many things to talk about, so all of those projects are cramped up in this segment over here. Those are albums that go from 6+ to 4-, and some of them I do recommend them since they might be even more to your liking, others I don't really think they're that much worth of your time. So with all that being said, let's just jump straight into the video. So at first let's talk about the brand new album of Vatican Shadow, a pretty short project, and Vatican Shadow has done multiple different projects over the years. He's pretty consistent on putting stuff out, but his projects can be really hit or miss. Now this one for me goes into some of my favorite directions when it comes to the sound of Vatican Shadow. I like the ambient techno and the industrial techno approaches on this one, and I believe that in some cases it makes for some really solid tracks, but when it comes to the more interlude stuff is where the album kinda loses me, and I believe that even in this short album there were certain tracks that didn't really manage to do all that much for the project, leaving only few certain moments to be considered highlights. A pretty solid project, possibly one of my favorite when it comes to some more recent Vatican Shadow stuff, but there was still more to be desired. The Garden has always been a project that for me has such potential. I really like how experimental and how chaotic they are and how they go into so many different sounds and directions with like rock and punk and electronic music. It is a really intriguing direction of art punk and experimental rock with electronic elements, weird instrumentations, weird vocals, but once again I find many of the ideas over here to be quite underwhelming. Even though there are certain moments that I do enjoy, it never really reaches a point where I am fulfilled. This over here is a pretty short project but also pretty chaotic, and even though I really like how ambitious it is, I would just hope there was just something more than just being ambitious, and I didn't really get it with this album as well. Like I said in my review of the very first Reina Sawayama album, for me the debut had the potential for something really powerful and something really great, but after some excellent teaser tracks, I found the overall result to be extremely disappointing, and for me since this one album didn't really manage to live up for the hype, I was convinced that she would never manage to do anything better than this again, and I feel that Hold the Girl sort of proves my point. A much less ambitious, much less adventurous album, and an album that feels extremely basic to the point where even people who really enjoyed the very first Reina Sawayama album didn't really seem to be head over heels for this brand new project, and I can sort of see why, since it mostly contains really bland pop elements. Now, I'd say that some of the melodies over here and some of the ideas are pretty cool. We're still talking about a pretty catchy project and I enjoyed some of the tracks, to the point where I wouldn't really say it's that much worse compared to the debut. It's just that the debut was much more inconsistent in comparison, with some really great highlights and other tracks that I really didn't care for. So for me, Hold the Girl, it's just a pretty average pop album for an artist that for me started with a really strong potential, and now I'm just not really that much interested with what she puts out. King Tude's new album is another one of those projects that goes into the more gothic rock and post-punk directions with its sound, containing more of like electronic guitars, which for me it doesn't really make for some of his most compelling projects. For me, King Tude projects work much better when we're talking about just simple, pure neo-folk stuff. This is where it's at its best for me. I still enjoy some of the ideas, I believe that it's a kinda imaginative album, but yes, certainly not one of the most appealing projects that I've heard from him. I believe that one of the reasons people really dislike this brand new Mars Volta album is because it's from the Mars Volta. I believe that if it was another name making this type of sound, one that didn't really have that much of a legacy with their very first albums, we might be talking about a bit of a more different reception. The Mars Volta had set the bar really high with some of their first projects, something that we've seen sort of deteriorating as the years would go by, but I sort of dislike the album for different reasons. I ended up feeling that this album was ridiculously repetitive, to the point where many of the tracks just felt identical, like it was just one idea continuing and never developing. There were some adventurous parts and there were certain moments where the album felt kinda ambitious, but for the most part I ended up kinda being bewildered by how repetitive and monotone this album was. I would expect a bit of a more variety to it, but I don't know, many of the tracks here felt quite identical. So yeah, I just find it to be an average project, which for me it doesn't really have that much to do with the fact that it's from the Mars Volta, just that I believe that it wasn't that much properly executed. I remember listening to an album from Mura Masa a few years back which I don't really like, and I can't really say that things seem to be that much better now, but I'd say that there is a bit of an improvement with this project, just being slightly more chaotic, experimenting with many different sounds of electronic music with many elements of like pop and R&B, which at some cases I'd say are implemented quite nicely, and there are multiple different features over here, which for me some of them work pretty fine with the tracks that we have over here. So yeah, this album is a bit of a mess, not really digging that much the ideas to it, but at least I can sort of give it credit for what it was going for. After a few pretty promising singles, the brand new album of Electric Callboy feels like a collection of those singles which has some deep cuts which for me were not really that much interesting. So yeah, for me the lack of cohesion out of this album kinda hurts this album and makes it much less compelling, because for me this could have been much more promising, but I can't really say that the final result we get over here is that much great. I'd say that the one thing that I like in this album in comparison to the more recent stuff that we've got out of Behemoth is that the drums over here are really cool. I really love the blast beats, I really like the sound of the drums, and it makes for a much more intense Behemoth project, which in this regard I'm really digging it. Apart from that, we're talking about a pretty overproduced album, one that sounds really clean and it mainly lacks the appeal that I get out of black metal and death metal projects. It's another attempt on a more approachable sound, which for me, it's not really my thing. Intensive Care have finally put out their debut album. Now the main reason why you might know of Intensive Care is from a split that they did with Full of Hell a few years ago. It was definitely the one release that put them on the spot, and it was a pretty decent split. So what we get with the full-length album of Intensive Care is actually a sound that it is kinda similar to what you might get with the Full of Hell project, just not that much with the grindcore aspect, but more of like a noise rock and post-hardcore version of Full of Hell, which certainly sounds quite promising. Unfortunately, I was kinda underwhelmed with this album. I'd say that for what it is, the album sounds kinda bland, and the ideas overall are just pretty average. I believe that there are some cool sections here and there, and some moments where the album just tries to be somewhat more different, but overall, I don't really know why, but I can't really get into this album. And also, for some reason, we ended up getting another album from the band the exact same day on a different label. This is sort of like what we saw with Portal doing the previous year, and it's also kind of the same case with the direction of the album, as Antibodies is an album that goes into a bit of a different direction, focusing more into like elements of industrial, noise, and dark ambient. But even though this album starts really strong and it's a direction of sounds that I'm digging much more, this is still a project that kinda disappointed me. I expected more out of it, but I didn't really like the mixing out of it, and I believe that the sound choice is also not that great. In terms of like industrial and noise music, this didn't really sound all that great. Think of it being kinda similar to what we got with the two collab albums of Full of Hell and The Body, or like with Sightless Pit. It goes into similar directions, it's just like a lesser version out of these albums with less interesting sound choices. I cannot really get why people seem to be that much in love with the newer stuff out of Death's Dynamic Shroud, though they've definitely changed their sound and gone into more carefully crafted stuff rather than just having their more standard vaporwave material from back in the day. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy some of their vaporwave stuff. I believe that Death's Dynamic Shroud actually have some of the better crafted vaporwave albums you can find out there, but I believe that with this more glitchy and experimental 80s aesthetic, there's only that much that you can do with it. At the end of the day, this feels more of like the direction we saw with some of the latest releases from Monotix Point Never, and those didn't even feel that much engaging for me in the first place. This album is really long and it's all over the place. It goes into so many different sounds and directions, and there has definitely been a lot of effort put out in this album, but for me it's just an album that I don't really see myself coming that much back into. Slipknot are back with a brand new album that seems that in some directions it goes much more back into the roots of nu metal in comparison to what we got with some of the latest stuff, though when it comes to their previous album We Are Not Your Kind, it was definitely one of the better Slipknot releases, but with this brand new album I'd say that we go back to the mediocrity of albums like All Hope Is Gone and The Great Chapter. For me, this is just another Slipknot album that it's not really all that interesting. I didn't really even find any of the singles to be all that much special. I believe that at the end of the day it's more of like Slipknot playing it kinda safe. I like the intensity of some of the tracks, but yeah, this doesn't really say much. It's not really that much of a great project, unfortunately. After a couple of solid singles and EPs, Shygirl finally releases her full-length album, which seems to go into a bit of a more commercial and approachable sound, focusing slightly more into the directions of R&B, but we still get some UK-based tracks and some slightly more experimental stuff that also have this more nasty approach to them that I really enjoy, but it's obviously kinda toned down in comparison to what we've got with EPs and singles in the past. It kinda plays it safe, but in my opinion, it could have been much worse. Overall, I'm really digging this debut. Could have been better, but at least there are a couple of highlights which make this a pretty decent project throughout. Freddie Gibbs is a really cool rapper, but this album, it's just simply okay. There is really nothing more or less about this album rather than just finding it a pretty decent project. It sounds really nice, but there's not something particularly that much exceptional or captivating about this album. It's simply a good project, and that's pretty much about it. The debut of Sonja is a pretty good heavy metal album, but we're not talking over here about just a heavy metal album. It is also about LGBTQ representation, trans representation, and there is a bit of a history behind this project. It is an exceptional release. I really like the vocals, it's possibly my favorite aspect out of this album. I personally would prefer it if the album was less one-dimensional, as some of the tracks ended up feeling kinda repetitive, and I also believe certain tracks could have been shorter. Some of them just drag on and feel kinda lengthy, but apart from that, this is definitely one of the most solid metal releases that I've heard all year, and this is a strong recommendation from me. And that's all for the short reviews of September 2022. What's your opinion on any of those albums and EPs? Like them, dislike them, why? And what do you want me to review next time? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.